Today, we're on Parliament Hill. At a time when the climate is crumbling, inequality is on the rise, and our leaders are beating the drums of war, let's talk about the issues, the solutions, and the power dynamics that got us here. My name is Alex Tyrrell, and I'm your host for this podcast, The Eco Mindset. So I've come here today to explore the issue of anti-Chinese racism in Canadian politics. Over the last few years, we've seen really a degradation in the relationship between Canada and the People's Republic of China. One of the things that happened is we've had a lot of outlandish claims about foreign interference, these conspiracy theories that the Chinese government is trying to take over Canadian politics and so on. This has led to the adoption of some pretty draconian laws, including Bill C-70, which would make anybody who is indirectly associated with somebody working for a foreign government register as an agent of a foreign state.
That person could be targeted and prosecuted under C-70 and face the prospect of life imprisonment.
And this branding or this label that we would attribute to so many Canadians is really a way to keep them out of the democratic process, to keep them from participating in Canadian democracy. Cool. You suggested that Chinese Canadians would be better to avoid the democratic process for the moment, given the fact that this law is on the books and poorly defined for the moment.
It pains me to say this. It really pains me to say this, but as you point out, we are in a climate now where our political class, has succumbed to a groupthink.
And particularly the Chinese Canadian community is being targeted by this law. There's a lot of anti-Chinese rhetoric in our mainstream media, in our mainstream politics here in Canada. And so we've come here today to the Canadian Parliament and the Senate to meet with Senator Woo, somebody who has been very outspoken against this foreign agent registry bill and who's very active on issues fighting against anti-Chinese racism in Canada. Thank you, Senator Woo, for welcoming us to your office here in East Block on Parliament Hill. I've been looking at your work for some time now, especially with respect to anti-Chinese racism in Canada, and particularly in Canadian politics and mainstream media. I was wondering if you could start by telling us a bit about your career and what led you to become a senator.
Mm-hmm. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Malaysia, grew up in Singapore. All my formative years were in those two countries. I came to Canada on a scholarship many years ago to go to a place called Lester Pearson College. I was one of the very fortunate scholarship students from Singapore, representing Singapore. And that was a formative experience for me in that it introduced me to Canada. Mm-hmm. And also introduced me to some ideas about the importance of international understanding and the vigorous promotion of peace around the world. To make a long story short, I went on to university, graduate school. I worked in Singapore. I was a central banker and an academic. Came to Canada in 1988.
The year I was born, actually.
Okay, well, that ages me, but important year, 1988. Right. I started my residency in Canada on the East Coast in Newfoundland. Mm-hmm. And spent 7 years there before I relocated to Vancouver, British Columbia. Again, fast forwarding a bit, I eventually joined the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, which is a think tank on Canada-Asia relations. I was its CEO from 2008 to 2015. I then I completed 3 terms, the mandatory, there's a maximum of 3 terms that I could do. I then became a senator in 2016. I am in the first cohort of Canadians appointed as independent senators through the new process, the so-called arm's length appointment process. and have been doing that for the last 8 years.
Right. Well, congratulations. And it is nice to see that this process of arm's length selection of senators seems to have yielded some positive results.
I won't speak for myself, but I looking at my colleagues, we really have some outstanding people there.
Yeah, excellent. So I wanted to talk about this bill C-70 that you've been very outspoken about. We've had all of this talk in the mainstream media about, Chinese interference in Canadian politics, and a lot of it based on a lot of very speculative reporting, a lot of leaks from CSIS and RCMP without substantiating proof, without witnesses and that sort of thing, and without, of course, a court of law or anything like that. Right. But it seems to have led to a bit of, anti-Chinese hysteria in Canadian politics, and the adoption of this law that will require anybody who is indirectly associated with anybody who works for a foreign government anywhere to register as a foreign agent. Can you tell us a bit more about this bill and how it got to this point?
Sure. Well, let me start by saying that I'm against foreign interference, as I'm sure you are, and as all Canadians should be. And we should do everything we can to protect our democracy, our society, and to protect Canadians against foreign interference. The most egregious forms of foreign interference that I am aware of have to do with Canadians who typically are former nationals of another country, who are being intimidated or threatened or coerced, mostly because of their views or their actions related to their native countries.
Right.
And this kind of coercion could take a variety of forms. It could be just sort of harassment, but it also could involve threats to either to them directly or to their families back in their home countries. This is unacceptable. We should not allow for this kind of, as they call it, transnational repression. And for a long time, the RCMP didn't have the tools to deal with these kinds of problems. Let me say that any kind of threats and intimidation and bullying is unacceptable.
Of course.
Whether it comes from a foreign agent or your neighbor, down the street. But while there was a way in which our authorities could deal with your neighbor down the street intimidating you or bullying you or threatening you, it was more difficult to deal with this kind of problem coming from overseas or coming from a foreign agent. So C-70, one of the aspects of C-70 deals with this problem. It creates a new set of offenses that will allow the police to more easily address intimidation, coercion, threats, and so on to Canadians, even if they are overseas and even if they involve foreign agents. It's going to be difficult to prosecute, right, but at least there are some tools that I hope will put a damper, if not a stop, to this kind of transnational repression. But C-70 goes much further than that.
Right.
Okay? C-70 also tries to create a class of criminal offenses that really, I think, infringe on our democratic rights and freedoms, essentially by casting what could be benign and very natural links that Canadians have with overseas parties, casting these benign links and connections as nefarious.
Mm-hmm.
And the language of the law will allow our enforcement authorities to cast a very wide net on individuals who are deemed to be, quote, in association with a foreign entity. And if you are deemed to be in association with a foreign entity and you participate in a political process, which is very broadly defined. It includes running for a school board, for example. If you do that and you are deemed to be in association with a foreign government and you don't register with the Commissioner of Foreign Transparency Registry, you could be prosecuted. And the maximum penalty under this offense is life imprisonment. So this is not a joke. This is not just about your reputation being sullied. That's bad enough. There are serious consequences that I feel will suppress the voices of Canadians who have links overseas, but particularly, and this gets to your question of anti-Chinese racism, the negative effects will fall disproportionately on Canadians with links to China. And China has been defined now as a threat or as almost as an enemy. And so anyone who has, as I say, benign, normal, family, corporate, other kinds of links with China could be caught in this trap.
Right. And obviously in China, the government plays a very big role in the society. So there's a lot of people that would work for the government and that sort of thing, right? So I think that also...
It would be impossible to have any kind of business or civil society or university or research relationship with Chinese counterparts without touching on the state apparatus. China is an authoritarian Leninist state, and this is not a defense of their system. That's their system, and they have to work through how they want the country to evolve. But what that means for Canadians who have links with China is that it would be easy for a malicious prosecutor or a malicious, ideologically driven Canadian to point the finger at someone to say that this person should be considered in association with the Chinese state, with some Chinese entity. That same person, Canadian, is involved in a political process. Maybe he's helping in a nomination campaign. Maybe his wife is running for the school board. Could be any kind of involvement in Canadian democracy. That person could be targeted and prosecuted under C-70 and face the prospect of life imprisonment.
Yeah, that's a really hefty potential sentence, right? Considering that there's people in Canada who kill people and who don't end up with a life sentence.
Right.
So that's pretty striking. Also, this notion of association, like in Canada, we have a lobbyist registry, right? So if you're going to be with a minister on behalf of a corporation, you have to register as a lobbyist. I think most people would be okay with employees of foreign governments who are perhaps sent here to advocate for politics to be perhaps registered or as diplomats or diplomats register and that sort of thing. But this goes way beyond that, right? It's just an association.
Absolutely. And I have, on the record, I have said that I support an expanded registry of lobbyists that captures individuals who are representing foreign entities, not only through direct paid arrangements, but through, quid pro quos or employment promises or that kind of thing. But we can do that through the lobbyist registry. And in fact, the lobbyist registry already captures paid arrangements on behalf of foreign entities to lobby me, for example. I think it would have been possible for the government to expand the definition of eligibility for the lobbyist registry to capture a broader set of individuals. If you come to see me and, you are actually representing whatever government, I think, I need to know that and Canadians need to know that. But the registry created by C-70, they call it the Foreign Influence, Transparency and Accountability Registry, goes much further in that it uses the word arrangements. You need to have an arrangement with a foreign entity, to require registration. But they define arrangements as someone who is doing something for the foreign entity at the direction of or in association with.
Or an association.
At the direction of, okay, I get that, right? But in association with is extremely vague. And as I've said in the Senate chamber, that could capture parliamentarians as well.
Right.
Because most of us belong to what we call parliamentary associations, bilateral parliamentary associations, where we have regular contact with parliamentarians and officials from another country, the US, Germany, France, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, so on and so forth. And the very goal of these interparliamentary associations is for us to influence our counterparts and for them to influence us.
Right.
So it can easily be argued that we are in association, with a foreign entity for the very purpose of influencing public policy. I've heard, my colleagues come back from the UK and they say, you know what, we should get rid of the tariff on British cheese because we want more double Gloucester in our retail stores.
Right.
Now, they got that from some British MP.
Yeah.
Right? Or the Welsh Cheese Association, whatever it might be. And they are consciously bringing back an influence from their connection with a foreign entity and trying to effect change in Canadian law.
So they would theoretically have to register as
it would seem to me
foreign agents for each country that they have any kind of
on the face of it
with.
Now, we don't yet. We have a registry. We have a law that creates a registry, but we don't have a commissioner. And we don't have the rules around how the registry will be implemented. So I'm watching very closely for the government's appointment of the commissioner and how the commissioner will define many of these terms and what sorts of exceptions he or she might put in place. That's very crucial for civil society to watch as well.
It's a lot of decisional power to place in the hands of a commissioner.
A lot. But the fundamental problem is that he or she has to work with the law. And the law has already said
association.
Arrangements includes individuals who are in association with a foreign entity. And I don't know how she's going to get around that. Now, he or she could easily exempt parliamentarians. And I suspect that's what will happen. But there are many others who will be caught in this dilemma. There are bilateral business associations, the Canada-US Business Council, Canada-Europe, Canada-Germany, Canada-France, Canada-China, Canada-Hong Kong. The list goes, hundreds of them. By definition, these associations seek to promote, trade and investment with the other country. And they do it in part by having regular exchange with their counterparts so that they can influence and be open to the influence of the foreign counterpart.
Right.
Do they have to register? Perhaps. But, the problem, as I said to you at the outset, is not the registration per se. If it was simply as benign or as mechanical as putting your name on a list because you have some kind of a connection with a foreign power, that's a nuisance. How much good will it do? Will it stop foreign interference? I doubt it very much. But we could perhaps say it's a nuisance. It's a bureaucratic procedure that politicians put in place so they feel good about themselves. Maybe we can live with it. But the risk is that if you don't register because you genuinely think you're not in association with a foreign government, and then you happen to get involved in a political process, like running for a school board or handing out a leaflet in favor of your local riding candidate.
Right.
And somebody says, oh, that person is part of an alumni association for university in India and is known to speak regularly with professors at the university who are very closely associated with the government.
Yeah.
And that person also happens to support some of the views of that government. We think that he or she is in fact in association with the foreign government, involved in a political process in Canada, and therefore should be prosecuted
And perhaps imprisoned.
and with a maximum penalty. Again, some people will say that will never happen. The prosecutors will never go for the extreme, but it's the principle here.
It can also depend on the political circumstances.
Of course
in
it
case
will.
of war and stuff like that, if there's people who are called, agents of the other side, things can pivot pretty quickly. And I saw that you wrote an article about this, and in the article you suggested that Chinese Canadians would be better to avoid the democratic process for the moment, given the fact that this law is on the books and poorly defined for the moment.
It pains me to say this. It really pains me to say this, but as you point out, we are in a climate now where our political class, has succumbed to a groupthink around the whole foreign interference threat, and they have in their heads the idea that certain countries are enemies of Canada, and that people associated with those countries, therefore, should be suspect. The way to fight this kind of prejudice and discrimination is, in fact, for greater democratic participation on the part of Canadians who disagree with those prejudiced views. But we now have a law that will essentially make it more difficult to do that. And
potentially dangerous.
And very dangerous for them and their families. And as it is, Chinese Canadians tend to be reticent when it comes to political participation for a number of cultural and historical reasons. They tend to stay away from controversy. They don't like to have a lot of visibility. And entering politics is a big step for many of them. And I'm not even talking about being a candidate. I'm talking about getting involved in campaigns and so on. But now there's the added risk that if you maintain ties with the PRC because of your family, because of your previous work, because you're a scholar, you're doing work on the construction of bridges, and the world leaders in bridge construction are the Chinese, right? You have ties with state-owned enterprises that are cutting edge when it comes to engineering issues, and you get involved in a political process, and you could be tagged as being in association. So, to answer your question, when my friends, anyone comes to me and talks about how they want to change things in Canada, how they want to be more involved in civil society and contribute to Canadian democracy, I say to them, you need to be aware of this new law, and the first thing you need to do is to protect yourself. And I hate saying that, because what I'm telling them is stay away from democracy. And this is the great irony of C-70. Everybody talks about how it was put in place to protect our democracy, to enhance our democracy. But in fact, in many cases, it's going to suppress democracy.
Yeah. I've heard you compare the Chinese Exclusion Act and the fact that it was adopted in a political climate in which it had very little opposition. You compared that to the bill C-70 now and the importance of it also. Could you tell us a bit more about the implications of this and the fact that you have Canadian citizens of Chinese origin or descent who it seems like as if they have second-class citizenship, they're allowed to come here and work and stuff like that, but it's don't participate in the democracy, don't run for office. You'll be either vilified in the media, as we've seen in many different cases, or you could have problems with the RCMP and that kind of thing. Can you tell us a bit more about how this fits into the history of anti-Chinese racism and laws in Canada?
Sure. Well, last year, 2023, was the 100th anniversary of the enactment of the Chinese Immigration Act of 1923, better known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. Most of us think of it as the Exclusion Act, meaning it stopped Chinese from coming to Canada. It did that. It did that for 24 years. But most people don't remember is that it also required every Chinese person who was already in the country to have to register.
Oh.
Okay, so, the echoes of registration are very powerful for the Chinese community. Every single Chinese person had to register with the authorities and to carry some kind of a document proving they had registered. Failure to register or failure to prove that you were the person in that registration document would expose you to the threat of fines, jail, or deportation. This was a tool of control and intimidation, and it took place for, as I say, 24 years. When I looked at the passage, how the bill came to become law, in the Parliament of Canada, what I found, well, first of all, what I found was that some of the most odious speeches were from my predecessors, senators from British Columbia,
Right.
and MPs from British Columbia. They said some of the most horrible things about Chinese people, and in effect, some of my senatorial predecessors from BC were saying that I should not be entitled to be in the position I am in today. But what is even more remarkable is the lack of dissent. And I think that's partly what you were getting at. We were in a climate at the time where everyone could find a justification for the Exclusion Act. It was deemed to be politically popular. It was felt as the right thing to do. And even people who had reservations about it did not give it much resistance. And so the bill passed. It passed. There wasn't a recorded vote, but, it passed essentially without dissent. And I worry about a similar thing happening today. But I want to be careful to say that we're not facing the same kind of exclusion that we faced 100 years ago. Of course we're not. There's no way, I sure hope not, but I can't see how Canada could once again have a blanket ban on the entry of all Chinese people or all Black people or all Arab people. I mean, God save us if we get to that place. Which is why modern exclusion is more insidious and more dangerous. Because people say, well, it's not the same as 100 years ago. We don't have to worry about that. But what is the new modern exclusion? The new exclusion is not about a blanket condemnation or exclusion of all Chinese people. It's about targeting or dividing, separating good Chinese people from bad Chinese people based on arbitrary, ideologically based criteria. If you happen to have a particular view on Hong Kong or Taiwan, if you happen to go back to the mainland often and maintain your connections with your former organization or university or business, you are inherently suspect. If you don't speak out publicly to condemn Xi Jinping, we will suspect you of being a Chinese agent. And this is happening.
Yeah.
This MPs are saying that. The media is saying that. The commentariat is saying that. You are hearing it in the public inquiry on foreign interference. Witnesses, like high-ranking witnesses, are throwing out names willy-nilly. No evidence. The only reason that they give for suspecting that these individuals and organizations are potential agents is that essentially they don't agree. The views are different.
Right.
So this is the modern exclusion. And in some ways, it's worse than the original exclusion because there's a veneer of respectability about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the right values or the right views. And if you define, if you have the temerity to define a set of views as the only acceptable views, then you've essentially cast out everybody else as dangerous or harmful.
Yeah.
And that's the problem we face.
And it's particularly concerning because I've seen it, you said before, that it's not really about finding a link of a collusion with a foreign government. It's more that the political points of view that the people are expressing are too close with that of another country. And
Right.
to say that like all Chinese people in Canada must condemn like mainland China
Right.
and everything, and that there can be no support shown for anything that China is doing anywhere in the world without being called a Chinese agent, I think is very problematic. And with this bill also, you mentioned that people can register as an agent, but then continue to participate in politics afterwards.
Yeah, that's a great irony. Yeah.
Yeah. But so you could think, well, people will just register and then they'll be able to run as candidates anyway. But, it would be very difficult, I think, for somebody, let's say, running for a big party like Liberal or Conservative to be also on the registry as a foreign agent.
Right.
It's a complete stigmatization. It would discredit a lot of what they're saying. So the registry makes it so that these people will be vilified by the media and basically have no chances of advancement in Canadian politics.
Correct. And, even if the registry is designed in such a way that it isn't too expansive, it's very narrow in its objective and reach, what will inevitably happen is that there will be rumor mills and snitching, whereby sometimes very powerful people will drop innuendo about a certain person, a community leader, for example, who, he's not registered, but I think somebody should take a look at him.
Yeah.
Right? That's going to happen for sure.
You have a political police, basically.
Of course you'll have that. And they can do that. Why? Because in association with allows you to do that.
Yeah.
You don't need to demonstrate that anybody is paid, for example, or has some kind of a quid pro quo with the foreign government. The fact that this person attended last night's 75th anniversary of the celebration of the founding of the People's Republic of China at the Westin Hotel.
Right.
There were 400 people there, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay. A few politicians, but lots of people from the community, including lots of people from the Chinese community. They were there celebrating a national day of another country. Some of them probably spent time talking to the Chinese diplomats and officials there. They may or may not share some of the views of that government. Are they going to be tagged as in association with? It's possible.
Yeah.
And even if the commissioner says, no, you don't have to register because you don't really fit the category, they'll be stigmatized.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's really unfortunate. I wanted to talk a little bit more globally about Canada-China relations.
Yeah, sure.
I was very surprised a while back to see that, for one, the Canadian military is sending both boats and aircraft down the Taiwan Strait.
Yeah.
A couple times with CBC journalists on board who are reporting it as, look how aggressive the Chinese government is. They're confronting us with planes and stuff like that. But I'm looking at this, I'm saying, like, why are these Canadian aircraft and warships on the other side of the world challenging Chinese air and water space, and then making it seem like as if China is the aggressor in this? How do you see the Taiwan issue and the way that Canada has handled it so far?
Well, the issue of cross-strait relations is fraught. It's very dangerous, and we should do everything we can to avoid a conflagration. Mm-hmm. That has to be the utmost priority. And we have to think very clearly about whether the way to prevent a catastrophic war, and this is not just a war between China and Taiwan, it will suck the world in. It's already sucked us in.
Right.
The way to prevent that catastrophe, whether it is through what we're doing now, which is, sending frigates to sail through the Taiwan Strait, and some other countries forming these minilateral defense alliances, stepping up military a presence in the region, providing certain kinds of signals to Taiwan that could be seen as provocative. Is that the way to preserve the peace and to avoid war? Or is there a better way to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm quite concerned that we have settled on the former approach, which is essentially greater militarization and a kind of signaling to Taiwan that we'll be there to fight with you, that sort of thing. I'm not sure that's the best way to preserve the peace. I would be 100% against the People's Republic launching a hot war on Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not convinced that they want to do that, but I don't want to push them into a position where they will take that step.
And so far, they've said that the use of force is on the table, but it's like distant kind of.
Correct.
It would be hard for them to rule it out.
Well, it's a red line for them. That one is very clear. And the red line, if the red line is crossed or a number of red lines are crossed, they have not taken off the table the possibility of a hot war. And if that happens, we have to be aware of our responsibility in causing that to happen.
Mm-hmm.
As much as we have to put responsibility on Beijing for taking the action of going to a hot war. But we should not delude ourselves into thinking that there is an option for the Chinese government, Beijing, to not consider unification as part of one of their top priorities. This has been the case since 1949. It's been consistent. It's been signaled to the rest of the world. It's part of the deal that was struck when we established diplomatic relations, the so-called One China policy. We can't expect that to just evaporate overnight.
Mm-hmm.
For us to cross a number of red lines and for the Chinese to not do anything about it. Right? I hope it doesn't happen, and a lot of responsibility will be on Beijing if they initiate a hot war that will cause immense suffering for people on both sides and for others. And my plea to the West, Canada in particular, is to think of other ways, better ways, where we can prevent war. I'm not sure that sending frigates to sail through the Taiwan Strait helps the situation.
Yeah. What purpose can that really serve? I mean,
well, it's provocative. Yeah. That's what it is. I mean, can you imagine if Chinese frigates were sailing 200 miles off British Columbia or California? We know what happened when Russian ships sailed close to Cuba with dangerous weapons.
Yeah.
The reaction of the United States was predictable, right? And we came close to a conflagration. But we don't seem to see the reverse somehow. So it's a plea really, on the one hand, for the goal of this policy. And I would hope the goal is not some abstract idea of preserving democracy. That's important.
Mm-hmm.
The goal has to be to prevent war, to promote peace, to seek the betterment of the societies of both Taiwan and the mainland, and to find the best paths for that to happen.
Yeah. And I think that most Canadians like peace, right? They want to see Canada play a positive role for the peace process internationally. But our foreign policy seems to have become increasingly aggressive. Whether it was Harper or Trudeau that's in power, they have some very aggressive stances on world affairs. And I saw that you made a speech where you talked about different blind spots of Canadian foreign policy. And you had mentioned that, unilateral support for Ukraine maybe makes it so that Canada cannot play as much of a role in the peace process as a lot of Canadians would like. I was wondering how you see that situation now, these confrontations with Russia and the NATO expansion, and what role could Canada play to de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine and try and bring peace to the region and try and avoid a nuclear war with Russia?
We don't have any role to play now in terms of a peaceful solution that involves some sort of negotiated outcome. We are essentially a belligerent in this war. I think we're on the right side of the angels. We're with the angels. We're right side of the dispute. But again, being on the right side is not enough in terms of where we want to go and what kind of outcome we seek. I just heard the Ukraine ambassador to Canada give testimony to the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, talk about how the most important priority is to protect the lives of her citizens, of Ukrainians. I agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. She will go on to say, I'm sure, that not at any price, but that is the question that we should all be asking. At what price, right? At what price do we continue a war? At what price do we allow for the continued loss of life in Ukraine and in Russia as well? And for Canada, what is the space that we are giving ourselves to be helpful when the time comes? And for sure the time will come. When the time comes for there to be some kind of negotiated solution, what space do we have left to be able to be constructive?
Yeah.
Because the one thing I'm sure about is that this conflict will not end with Ukrainian troops at the gates of Moscow.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to end with the collapse of Russia. Maybe Putin will go, but that will not change the essential dynamic of Russia being in Europe, being a very big player in that continent, having a different cultural and political ethos and background, one which we're not comfortable with, but one which is real and which exists. That will not go away. And the time will come where there will have to be some kind of negotiated solution. And will Canada be able to play a role? Right now, the answer is no.
Yeah. Very interesting. And just before we leave, I'd like to get your opinion about Palestine. What's happening over there? I've seen that you've made some interventions, questioning, for example, the cutting of the funding to UNRWA, the aid agency, and that sort of thing. Canada seems to have, suspended some weapons exports permits to Israel, but in my view, at least, has not spoken up nearly strong enough in favor of the Palestinian people who are subjected to this treatment with the backing of the United States and with the backing of Canada in a lot of ways as well.
It's hard to look at what is happening in Gaza and on the West Bank and compare that with how we are responding to the Russian aggression in Ukraine, and to not conclude that there's a massive double standard going on. And I think Canadians actually see that. I know most of the global South sees that. And this double standard by the West, essentially, in how they approach the Ukraine situation and how they approach Gaza, is undermining the credibility of Western powers. I don't know how deeply our foreign affairs officials see that and how they intend to respond. But so far, we are doubling down on our double standards.
Right.
And it is further eroding at our credibility as a fair-minded player in the international space. We had testimony on Gaza as well. Just a couple of weeks ago, we heard from humanitarian organizations who told us of the horrific situation in Gaza. One of them said to us that every red line has been crossed. Every red line. There have been abuses of international humanitarian law and essentially war crimes. And Canada has not said anything about this. Canada, I think, is starting to worry a little bit about complicity in war crimes.
Because there could be some legal consequences.
There could be legal consequences. And that's partly why I think the Canadian government has put a suspension of exports of certain military equipment. But, it's kind of sad. It's kind of sad that it would take the possibility, the threat of being complicit in war crimes to shake our government into action. Like, isn't it bad enough that 40,000 Palestinians have been killed, which includes 17,000 children? Isn't it that bad enough for us to take a more proactive stance that's more supportive of the Palestinian position? As you know, we've either vetoed or abstained on a number of UN resolutions in support of the Palestinian state. But, if it takes the fear of complicity to shake us into action, I'll take it. And I just hope that the big thinkers in our government who understand international humanitarian law and the violations of that law and how Canada could be caught up in it will accelerate our very gradual shift in support for the Palestinian cause.
Right. I'd like to thank you very much for taking the time to meet with me. It's been really a pleasure getting your insights about so many important issues, and you've really restored my confidence a bit in the Senate. Also, it's great to see that this process by Trudeau to have independent senators seems to yield some very positive results. And so I wish you the best of luck in pushing for progressive values going forward. And I hope we can stay in touch.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Good.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I talked rambled a bit too much. Will you be doing some editing, or are you going to?
I think so. But I didn't hear anything that I would edit out.
Oh, okay.
Well, that concludes our interview with Senator Woo. I found his perspectives on foreign policy very interesting, and I admire his courage to speak out against anti-Chinese racism and against, this anti-Chinese hysteria that we have right now in Canadian politics. I think that members of the Chinese Canadian community have a lot to contribute to Canada in many ways, but the democracy is part of that. I think that people in Canada, Canadian citizens of Chinese descent, should have the rights, just as any other Canadian citizen does, to participate in our democratic processes, to be able to run for office without being vilified and labeled as the agent of a foreign power. I'm very concerned that this bill and this, anti-Chinese hysteria that we have in Canadian politics will have significant impacts on the Chinese Canadian community and will degrade our democracy here in Canada. So this was the first episode in a series that we're doing on the Eco Mindset podcast about anti-Chinese racism in Canada and Quebec and Canadian politics. If you like this episode, please leave us a comment with your thoughts. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you next time.